Eleanor Prescott had always believed in rituals. On the morning of her 40th wedding anniversary, she woke early, just as she had every year, and padded barefoot into the sun-drenched kitchen to prepare Charles's favorite breakfast: blueberry scones, soft-boiled eggs, and a pot of French-pressed coffee. No cream, no sugar. Outside, the spring breeze teased the magnolia blossoms in the garden she had planted when they first moved in. Everything smelled like memory. She wore a silk robe Charles had gifted her on their 25th anniversary. It still held the faint scent of jasmine from the sachets in her drawer. She had carefully laid out a silver frame on the kitchen island, holding their wedding photo, him in his navy dress uniform, her in ivory lace and hope. That photo had followed them from house to house, standing sentinel through years of moves, miscarriages, promotions, and betrayals so quiet she barely noticed them at the time. Today, she thought, would be a celebration of endurance. She had planned a small dinner party, just close friends. Diane was bringing the wine, of course. She always insisted. "You cook, I pour," she'd said on the phone, her voice bright with affection. Ellie had laughed, swallowing the odd pang she'd felt at Diane's cheeriness. But that was Ellie's gift, burying discomfort with grace. At 8:12 a.m., Charles walked into the kitchen. He was already dressed, too dressed, dark slacks, blazer, the cologne he only wore to board meetings. His phone was in his hand, thumb twitching nervously over the screen. "Morning," Ellie said, offering a smile. "Hungry?" Charles didn't answer immediately. He set his phone down on the counter and looked at her. Something about the way he looked at her made the room suddenly feel smaller. "Ellie," he said, voice low and clipped, "we need to talk." She blinked. "Of course, after breakfast?" "No," he said, "now." She set the coffee pot down too quickly, spilling a bit onto the counter. Still, she said nothing, just waited. He didn't sit. "I'm leaving you," he said like he was announcing the weather. "I've filed the paperwork. It'll arrive this week." Her fingers gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles whitening. "What?" "I've been unhappy for a long time," he continued. "We both know this hasn't been working." Her mind struggled to catch up. She tried to speak but could only whisper, "Is there someone else?" Charles exhaled, like he'd been holding the secret for years and now felt relief. "Yes," he said, "it's Diane." Time stopped. Ellie stared at him, not understanding at first. Diane? Her Diane? The woman who'd held her hand through her first miscarriage? The godmother to their son, who had died in a car accident in college? The woman who had slept on their guest bed after her own divorce, sobbing into Ellie's lap? "She makes me feel alive," Charles added. "She understands me in ways you just don't anymore." Ellie couldn't breathe. She didn't cry. Something colder took root in her chest. A slow, creeping frost. "You've been together?" she asked quietly. "For nearly 9 years," he said. "It started gradually. I never meant to hurt you. But we're in love." She looked down at the scones, at the wedding photo still propped beside them. The smiling young woman in lace had no idea this moment was waiting for her on the other side of 40 years. "And what about the house? The business?" she managed. "We've spoken to a lawyer," he said. "It's all very amicable. Diane and we'd like to stay in the house for now. We're thinking of renovating, making it ours." Something inside Ellie snapped. Not with a bang, but with an eerie silence, like a string pulled too tight, finally breaking. And still, she smiled. "I see," she said softly. Charles paused, perhaps waiting for an outburst, a slap, a scream. But Ellie simply wiped the coffee off the counter with a cloth. Slow and precise, as if the world hadn't just collapsed around her. "Thank you for telling me," she said. And then she turned away from him, walked into the sunroom, and closed the door behind her. Outside, the magnolias bloomed, quiet, white, and cruel. Ellie did not cry. Not that day, not the next. Not even when the movers came 2 weeks later and hauled her grandmother's piano, her piano, into a van labeled with Diane's return address. She sat in the corner of the den with a cup of tea, legs crossed at the ankle, watching them carry out the life she had spent 40 years curating. The men gave her the occasional awkward glance, perhaps expecting protest. But Ellie simply nodded when they asked, "This one too, ma'am?" "Take it all," she replied. Once the last box was gone and the truck rolled away, Ellie stood in the empty hallway where portraits once hung. The house smelled of lemons and fresh paint, Diane's doing, no doubt. New beginnings needed new scents. Ellie walked to the built-in cabinet beneath the staircase. It looked ordinary. 4 white panels, 2 drawers, and a lower cupboard that always stuck on the left. Inside it, behind a row of vases and photo albums, was a locked ledger book bound in deep burgundy leather. The gold embossing had worn off, but Ellie's handwriting inside was crisp, meticulous, and merciless. She ran her fingers along the spine like greeting an old friend. The pages were sectioned, cross-indexed, and color-coded. Each section corresponded to one of her invisible investments, a term she'd coined over a decade ago. While Charles thought she was planning garden clubs and spa retreats, Ellie had spent her quiet hours reading financial news, following threads through offshore tax havens, and learning how to build corporations that didn't technically exist. The first entry was dated June 3, 2009, the day she found the first suspicious bank statement tucked in Charles's study drawer. There had been an extra $200,000 bonus not mentioned in their joint accounts. When she'd asked about it, he'd brushed her off. Complicated tax stuff. Nothing to worry about, she worried. That was the day she decided to stop being the good wife and start being the invisible one. Through an acquaintance from her college days, Lorraine Cho, now a banker in Singapore, Ellie opened her first anonymous account. She used it to tuck away tiny amounts, birthday gifts from Charles, returns from stocks he thought were sold, money from jewelry he never noticed was missing. Over time, it grew. 1 account became 3. 3 became 10. By 2015, she owned 4 shell companies, 3 condos under borrowed names, and a silent partnership in a vineyard in southern France. Charles, who still patted her on the head when she misunderstood a financial term, had no idea. She flipped through a page marked Belize Tide Flower Trust, $850,000. Next to it, a smiley face doodled in the margin. It had been a personal milestone, the moment she crossed $1 million in liquid assets. Ellie hadn't always been ruthless. She had once believed in shared futures. But over the years, Charles had trained her to shrink. He made her feel small in the boardroom, silly at dinner parties, and irrelevant at home. Diane had helped, of course, with subtle sympathy that always walked the line between comfort and condescension. Together, they had pushed her into the shadows. And she had let them. But while they thought she was fading, Ellie was simply gathering. Her phone buzzed on the windowsill. A text from an unknown number flashed briefly before disappearing. Zurich bank statement delivered to secure inbox. No flags. It was from Lorraine. Ellie closed the ledger. Her hands were steady. She walked to the mirror and examined her face. No tears. No cracks. Just a woman who had been underestimated for far too long. She tapped the edge of the mirror and whispered, "Time to cash in." Then she walked upstairs. Not to pack, but to plan. Charles and Diane believed they'd taken everything. The house. The status. The narrative. What they didn't know was that Ellie hadn't just prepared for heartbreak, she had insured against it. And now, the woman they left behind was no longer a victim. She was an architect, and the first draft of her revenge was already written, in a ledger with no name and no mercy. Diane always had a flair for theatrics. Within a month of Ellie's departure, Diane had fully settled into the Prescott estate, as if it were a stage set for her long-overdue starring role. She replaced the drapes with gauzy lavender ones, repainted the walls in oyster gray, and hosted brunches on the back patio that looked eerily similar to the ones Ellie used to arrange. The neighbors whispered, but no one dared confront her. In a town like theirs, wealthy, mannered, quietly vicious, betrayal only mattered if you lost. Diane had not lost. or so she thought. She wore Ellie's silk robes in the mornings, her diamond tennis bracelet in the evenings. Charles, ever the image-conscious executive, spun the new romance as a fresh chapter born from years of friendship. He gave interviews to local magazines and posed for smiling photos with Diane in their redesigned living room, photos that Ellie naturally clipped and added to a new section of her ledger. "Actors," she muttered to herself, sipping Earl Grey in her modest but tidy rental across town. It had only taken one phone call to her attorney to ensure she received the minimum from the divorce settlement, just enough to keep up appearances while she positioned her pawns. Ellie hadn't just disappeared quietly, she had re-entered the scene under a different mask. Her first step was to plant the first crack in Diane's polished veneer. She did it anonymously, of course. A padded envelope was delivered to the editorial office of the Bloom Hill Weekly, a local society paper that thrived on scandal dressed up in civility. Inside, a scanned court transcript from 1998, filed under a sealed alias, now mysteriously unsealed. It detailed a negligence case involving a luxury spa in Napa Valley, where a young woman had nearly died from a tainted skin treatment. The woman had received a silent payout. The spa's managing director? One Diane R. Loring, Diane's maiden name. The article, titled "New Queen of Bloom Hill Has a Blotted Crown," ran 2 days later. Ellie read it slowly over breakfast. The tone was gossipy, but restrained, the facts laid out with elegant shade. No direct accusations, just questions, suspicion. A quiet little storm forming just outside the Prescott's picture-perfect porch. Diane went into damage control immediately, issuing a vague statement about false documents and cyber harassment. But Ellie knew her well, knew that Diane, behind her confident grin, was already unraveling. She could imagine her snapping at Charles, blaming him for not shielding her better. The fracture between them would widen, eventually. Ellie wasn't in a hurry. Charles, meanwhile, had other problems. 2 of his longtime business investors abruptly pulled out of a pending real estate deal. When his assistant asked for clarification on a mysterious wire transfer to an untraceable vendor in Dubai, he barked and told her to forget it. She didn't. The assistant, a bright girl named Naomi, had recently received an anonymous tip on LinkedIn with screenshots of internal documents that hinted at financial misconduct. The sender? A woman calling herself LPLP stood for Ledger Project, Ellie's internal name for her operation. It was part revenge fantasy, part forensic audit. And every page she turned, every memory she dissected, made her more precise. Back in the Prescott house, Diane tried to reassert control by throwing a spring renewal party. She invited their entire circle, donors, socialites, influencers. She wore a white pantsuit. Charles stood beside her, smiling stiffly. But even amid the laughter and jazz quartet, there was tension in the air. The questions. The curious glances. A woman from the city council even whispered, "Didn't she used to work at that spa, the one with the lawsuit?" Photos from the party were uploaded to Instagram within hours. Ellie didn't look at them. She looked instead at her next target, a small bank account Diane once opened under a fake name to pay for cosmetic procedures during her first divorce, an account Ellie had stumbled across years ago when Diane drunkenly used Ellie's laptop to book a spa weekend and forgot to log out of her email. It still existed, and Ellie had the login. She smiled, not the smile of vengeance but something cooler, calculated, surgical. Charles and Diane had taken her world and tried to replace it with a cheap imitation. But mirrors lie, and Ellie had just begun to crack the glass. Ellie returned to the Prescott estate under cover of darkness, not through the front gates, where the security cameras were newly installed, likely Diane's idea. No, Ellie took the side path behind the hedges, the one only she remembered, the one Charles once called her secret route during their courtship. A gardener's path. the one she used to sneak out through when she needed space from dinner parties, filled with pretentious men and women who only called her by her husband's name. Mrs. Prescott. The house loomed above her, opulent and cold in the moonlight. Every window was lit. A party. Again. Laughter spilled out faintly from the garden. Ellie watched from the shadows as guests moved about with glasses of wine, Diane flitting among them like she was born to this place. Ellie's fingers curled around the wrought iron fence. She wasn't here to confront anyone. Not yet. She had come for something buried. At the edge of the property was the memorial garden, a modest stone bench beside a weeping cherry tree, a bronze plaque nestled in the soil, in loving memory of Thomas Charles Prescott, our beloved son. 1987 to 2005. Ellie knelt beside it, brushing away the pine needles that had gathered over the past month. The wind rustled the tree branches, and for a moment, the silence felt like her son's voice, soft, sorrowful, unfinished. Tommy had died in a car accident at age 18. The driver had been a friend. Alcohol had been involved, but no one ever talked about the real cause. Charles's fury when Tommy confessed he didn't want to go into business, didn't want his father's company. He wanted to study art. That night, father and son had fought for hours. Words like disgrace and ungrateful had been shouted. Ellie had heard them from behind the bedroom door. The next morning, Tommy left in a rage. He never came home. Ellie touched the plaque now and whispered, "It's almost time, sweetheart." Then, from the pocket of her coat, she removed a flash drive. It contained dozens of audio files, recordings Charles had made over the years, dictating notes, business calls, even private conversations he assumed would be deleted. But Ellie, always the tech-challenged wife, had long ago installed backup software that funneled those recordings into a hidden server. Among them was one conversation that had haunted her. Charles, Tommy needed discipline. All that emotional crap was Diane's influence. Those weekend painting classes? Pathetic. I was trying to make a man out of him. Diane, you were hard on him. Charles, I had to be. Otherwise, he'd end up just like Ellie. Soft, weak. Ellie had listened to it only once. Then she stored it. Now, it would be part of her next move. She stood slowly, brushing soil from her knees, and made her way back through the hedges. The laughter behind her rose to a crescendo, then turned tinny as a familiar voice rang out. Diane, giving a toast. To reinvention, she shouted. Ellie paused just outside the line of sight. The nerve of it. Reinvention. She remembered when Diane's first marriage ended. Ellie had taken her in, fed her, helped her find therapy, and now here she was, wearing Ellie's crown, living Ellie's life, rewriting Ellie's story. But not for long. The next day, an anonymous email landed in the inbox of a grieving mother's foundation Diane sat on the board of. Attached was a transcript of Charles's recorded conversation. It spread like a match dropped in dry grass. Suddenly, a buzz began to build, an undercurrent of disgust, cloaked in polite restraint. Within days, the foundation, quote, graciously accepted Diane's resignation. Charles, furious, confronted Diane about the leak. But Diane denied everything. Why would I record you, Charles? She hissed. This reeks of Ellie. For the first time, her voice cracked with panic. Ellie watched the fallout from afar, methodical and calm, like a gardener pruning a rotting vine, snip by careful snip. But she didn't smile, not this time, because this wasn't the fun part. This was the reckoning. And the deeper she dug into the garden of her old life, the more ghosts she found buried beneath the roses, secrets no one had dared unearth. Until now. Ellie always remembered Diane's voice before anything else. Not the perfume, not the hair flips or crocodile tears, but the voice. Bright, breathy, laced with the kind of warmth that made people lean in. Diane had a way of turning even the cruelest truths into something almost comforting. Oh, sweetie, she once said after Ellie miscarried their second child, maybe it just wasn't meant to be. It had taken Ellie years to realize that comfort and condescension often wore the same dress. Now, Ellie sat at her small desk in the rental, reading a decades-old lease agreement between Diane and her first husband, Clark Loring. A detail had caught Ellie's eye during a casual records search she'd asked a private investigator to perform months ago, just before the divorce finalized. Buried in the financial clauses was an unusual addendum, the best friend clause. The clause granted Diane access to a private inheritance from Clark's family trust, in the event of hardship, as confirmed by a written affidavit from a lifelong friend. The friend? Eleanor Prescott. Ellie remembered that afternoon in 1997 clearly now. Diane had shown up in tears, clutching a pen and a legal envelope. "Just a formality," she'd said. "I just need someone to confirm I'm in distress so I can access funds for the lawyer. Please, Elle, you're my rock." Ellie, still loyal then, had signed it without question. And what had Diane done with that access? Not fought for her marriage, as she'd promised. Not rebuilt her life from the ground up. She'd used the money to fund a down payment for a condo on the coast, the same one she had brought Charles to, according to a hotel invoice Ellie had unearthed just last week. The betrayal hadn't started a year ago. It hadn't started 5 years ago. It had been decades in the making. A slow corrosion masked by wine nights, birthday brunches, and whispered envy passed off as affection. So Ellie made a call. "Lorraine," she said once her friend in Singapore picked up, "I need you to send me the statement for the Larimar account, and I need it formatted for legal review. I'm ready to make a donation." "A donation?" Lorraine's voice was puzzled. "To what?" "To Diane Loring's undoing," Ellie said calmly. 2 days later, a thick envelope arrived at the offices of the Bloomhill Women's Trust, where Diane had just been nominated as honorary chair. Inside, notarized proof that Diane had lied under oath to access trust funds, along with wire transfer receipts showing how the money had been routed to her personal real estate purchase under a false name, Melinda Crane, a pseudonym Diane had once jokingly said she'd use if she ever became famous enough to need privacy. Ellie knew the joke because she had been there when Diane said it, at a beach in Marbella, while Charles took the photo. When the story hit, it wasn't in the Bloomhill Weekly. It went national. The Post ran it under a gleeful headline, "Socialite Exposed, Charity Chair Allegedly Committed Financial Fraud with Help from Best Friend." Charles exploded. Not just at Diane, but at his publicist, his attorney, even his housekeeper. "How did this get out?" he demanded in a viral video leaked by a party guest. "How far back does this go?" "Far, Charles. Farther than either of them ever realized." In the quiet of her rented home, Ellie watched the headlines flood her inbox. She didn't smile. She simply flipped open the ledger and drew a line through Diane's name with a gold pen. Not gone. Just finished. That night, a message came through her secure Proton mail account. One line from Lorraine. "Zurich lawyer ready when you are. Your passports are finalized." Ellie responded with 2 words. Not yet. Because there was still one debt unpaid. The one Charles owed her. Not in money or in memories, but in truth. He had taken her years, her peace, her child's dignity. But now, it was time to take something he would never recover. And that chapter was almost ready to begin. Charles Prescott had always believed his sharpest weapon was his mind. He built his legacy on calculated charm and cold efficiency, a man who could cut million-dollar deals before lunch and destroy a rival's reputation by dinner. "Control the narrative," he often told junior associates. "Perception is profit." But control, Ellie knew, was only an illusion, and Charles was about to lose his grip. It began with a simple, innocuous-looking envelope delivered to the board of Prescott Marwell Holdings, the firm Charles co-founded in his 30s. The return address was a shell company registered in Belize. Inside, 36 printed pages of internal emails, accounting irregularities, and whistleblower testimony, all carefully organized, bound, and anonymous. The report alleged years of tax avoidance, shadow shell companies used to reroute project funds, and falsified invoices tied to land development deals in Southeast Asia. Each transaction traced back to Charles's personal approval codes. Charles received a copy on his desk the next morning. At first, he laughed. "Anonymous garbage," he scoffed, tossing it onto the side table. But when the compliance officer came knocking with questions, and when 2 board members requested a, quote, temporary leave of absence pending internal review, the sweat began to bead at his temple. By the end of the week, Bloomberg had picked up a leaked copy. The headline was brutal. "Prescott Empire under scrutiny, financial giant accused of global tax fraud." Diane tried to spin it. "It's clearly Ellie," she hissed, pacing the living room like a cornered animal. "She's trying to destroy you and me." Charles snapped. "She's not smart enough to pull this off." But he didn't believe it anymore. Not really, because Ellie had always been quiet, not stupid. And now, her silence was roaring louder than his empire ever had. Across town, Ellie sat in a cozy cafe she once used to host charity planning meetings. No one noticed her. She wore a soft scarf, round sunglasses, and a serene smile. The laptop in front of her displayed a secured dashboard, her final gift from Naomi, Charles's former assistant. Before Naomi quit in a blaze of passive-aggressive glory, Ellie had offered her a generous offshore thank you bonus, and one request: access to Charles's internal communications system, the one he used for off-the-books dealings. Naomi didn't hesitate. Through that portal, Ellie uncovered not just Charles's tax tricks, but personal correspondences that made her stomach churn. Charles. Ellie always had that look, like a stray dog you feel guilty for. "I married her out of pity." Diane. "You married her for her father's connections. Don't lie." Charles. "And her silence? She never asked questions." He was right about that, once. But Ellie had learned. She traced one particular transaction from an investment account in Singapore to a supposedly philanthropic venture in Africa. Except the nonprofit didn't exist. The money? Redirected to an art broker known for laundering cash through inflated canvas sales. It was almost poetic. Art. The thing Tommy had loved most. The thing Charles had sneered at. Ellie prepared a second dossier. This time, not for the board. This one went to the Department of Justice. And the art broker? He was already on a watch list. The moment Charles's name surfaced in relation to it, Ellie knew federal eyes would turn to him. By week's end, the Prescott Marwell board had frozen his shares. His reputation, once invincible, was now radioactive. Real estate blogs called him a toxic liability. Clients pulled out. Investors ghosted. Still, Charles clung to the last scrap of denial. "We can bounce back," he muttered to Diane. "I just need to hold the press off, secure some emergency capital. We have the lake house, don't we?" Diane looked away. Because the lake house? That had been quietly sold 6 months ago. By Ellie. Using power of attorney Charles had granted her years earlier, one he forgot to revoke. He only found out when his lawyer called, baffled. "Charles," the man said, "the house wasn't in your name anymore. It was held in a trust, Lantern Trust, under Eleanor Prescott." Charles threw the glass he was holding. It shattered against the fireplace stone, echoing through the hollow halls of a home that now felt less like a sanctuary and more like a stage collapsing beneath him. He didn't sleep that night. And for the first time in 40 years, Charles Prescott had no plan. No fallback. Only the growing suspicion that the woman he once dismissed as background noise had become the storm swallowing his legacy. And she wasn't finished. Not yet. The letter came in an unmarked envelope. No return address. No handwriting. Just a neatly typed note slipped through the mail slot of Ellie's rented cottage like a ghost from another life. "You don't know everything. Look in the study safe. Code 0625. You'll want to see what he kept hidden." There was no signature. Just that. Ellie stared at it for a long moment, her mind swimming. June 25th. Their wedding anniversary. She hadn't stepped foot inside the main house since she visited Tommy's memorial weeks ago. But this was different. The study had always been Charles's domain. A room where even Diane had barely crossed the threshold. It was where he took phone calls late at night, where he kept his single malt scotch in crystal decanters and lined the walls with first editions of books he never read. Ellie had dusted that room for decades, but never been allowed inside it. Until now. That night, under a moonless sky, she made her way to the house again. She knew the routine. When the alarm was off, they always forgot to reset it after late dinners. When the housekeeper left, which camera angles left blind spots along the perimeter? She was inside within minutes. The study smelled the same: cedar, leather, and something cold and sterile underneath it all. Her eyes scanned the walls until she found the large painting above the fireplace. A gift from a client, Charles once claimed. Ellie knew better. It was there to hide the safe. She pulled it aside, entered the code. The lock clicked open with a quiet thud. Inside, Ellie found documents, bank files, real estate transfers, passports, and a smaller fireproof envelope, labeled "Personal, not to be destroyed." Her breath caught. She opened it. Inside was a single photo, color slightly faded, taken on a beach. Marbella, 2004, Diane and Tommy. Not a group shot, just the two of them. Standing close. Too close. Tommy was 17. Shirtless, sunburned. Diane in a black halter dress. Her hand was on his shoulder. Ellie's stomach turned. At first, she thought it might be innocent. A summer photo. An awkward pose. But then she flipped it over. In Diane's handwriting, "He'll never love you the way he loves me." He never did. There was no signature, no explanation, just that message. Ellie sat down, dizzy. Her mind reeled back. Marbella, that strange week when Tommy had grown distant, quiet. Diane had stayed behind at the villa with a headache, while Ellie and Charles went out. The fights that had started when they got home. Tommy's sudden refusal to speak to Diane at all. And later, when he cut off contact with her entirely, saying only that some people don't deserve forgiveness. Ellie had assumed it was over some disagreement, something small, something explainable. She had never imagined, no, she refused to, and yet the photo trembled in her hands. A wave of nausea rolled over her. Had Charles known? Had he found this too? Had he kept it because he wanted to protect Diane? Or to punish her later? Or worse, had he suspected something between them all along and buried it because it was easier than facing it? The question hollowed her. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't about money or revenge or even justice. This was something else. Ellie placed the photo back in the envelope and tucked it into her coat. She closed the safe, straightened the painting, and walked out of the study without touching anything else. Outside, the air hit her like a slap, crisp, sharp, and unrelenting. She had thought she was prepared for every secret, every skeleton. But this cut deeper. Not just because of what might have happened, but because her son had died carrying that weight, alone. Ellie stood in the garden for a long time, staring at the house that had once been hers. The house where laughter once echoed. The house where love died. And something changed inside her. The revenge wasn't enough anymore. Not if this was true. This wasn't about bringing them down anymore. It was about unearthing everything, no matter how painful, no matter how dark. Charles and Diane had taken more than her pride, her peace, her future. They had taken her son's truth. And now, Ellie was going to make sure they felt every ounce of that loss. Every day. Every breath. Because the next chapter wouldn't be a reckoning. It would be a reckoning with fire. The invitation arrived in thick cream cardstock, nestled in a gilded envelope, the kind that screamed old money and polished lies. You are cordially invited to the Prescott Marwell Annual Legacy Gala, an evening of celebration, philanthropy, and the future. Ellie read it twice, the irony dripping like syrup. She hadn't been invited in years, though it had been her idea to start the gala when Charles was still building his empire. Back then, she'd handled every detail: the charity partnerships, the seating arrangements, the menus. It had been her way of building something real behind the scenes. This year, though, the gala was Diane's production. Diane billed on the invitation as the event's co-chair and vision coordinator, a title as vapid as it was smug. Ellie accepted immediately. She didn't need a +1, she was bringing the storm. The night of the gala, the ballroom at the Langston Hotel glittered with chandeliers and diamonds. Wealth hummed in every corner. Familiar faces paraded through the doors. Politicians, CEOs, washed-up celebrities with too much Botox and not enough memory to recognize the woman slipping past them in a sleek navy gown and pinned chignon. Ellie knew how to disappear in plain sight. For years, she'd been wallpaper. Pleasant, forgettable, necessary, only when the wine ran low or someone needed a photo of the power couple. But not tonight. Tonight, she was the weapon. She moved through the crowd like smoke, unnoticed but always close enough to hear the lies. Charles stood near the stage, shaking hands, his smile stretched too wide. Diane floated beside him in silver silk, radiant and hollow. Ellie let herself watch for a moment. She didn't see love. She saw fear. Tightness behind Charles's eyes. The way Diane's laugh came too fast, too loud, the cracks were spreading, and Ellie was about to shatter what was left. At exactly 8:37 p.m., the lights dimmed. A spotlight hit the stage. Diane took the microphone. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she purred. "This event means so much to the Prescott Marwell family. It's a celebration of our commitment to transparency, innovation, and..." Her words stopped, mid-sentence, because the screen behind her flickered, then changed. First, a photo of Charles and Diane in Marbella, 2004. Then, another image, bank records, dated and damning, and then, the photo, the one from the safe. Diane and Tommy. Gasps rippled across the room, murmurs turned to a buzz, then into a wave of confusion, disbelief, and horror. Ellie stood at the edge of the ballroom, hands folded. Calm. Composed. She had hired a media technician 2 weeks earlier, anonymously with untraceable payment, to hack into the gala's presentation feed, 1 minute of footage. That's all she needed. Back on stage, Diane looked frozen, mouth agape. Charles turned a shade paler than she'd ever seen. He grabbed the mic, voice cracking. "There's been a technical issue. Please, if we could just..." But the images kept coming. Not just one betrayal. Dozens. Shell companies, wire transfers, whispers caught in emails. Proof of everything. Then the screen went black. A beat of silence. Ellie stepped forward. No longer hidden. No longer quiet. People turned. Recognition dawned. Whispers surged like a wave. Is that Eleanor Prescott? She climbed the steps slowly. Took the second mic. Her voice was clear, controlled, measured like a blade. "Thank you for joining us tonight," she said, eyes sweeping the room. "It's wonderful to be surrounded by so many familiar faces. I helped build this gala years ago with my husband, Charles, back when we still pretended to be partners." A stunned hush. "Tonight's presentation wasn't a mistake," Ellie continued. "It was a reckoning, not for me, but for the people you've trusted, with your donations, your business, your legacies." She turned to Charles, then to Diane. "I stood beside you both for 40 years. I loved you. I defended you. I buried my own grief while you fed on secrets. But the one thing I never was? Blind." Security moved forward, but someone in the crowd said, "Let her speak." Others nodded. Ellie looked directly at Charles now. "I know what you did. I know what you allowed. And so does everyone else now. Then, softly she added, "And I know what you did to our son." Gasps again. Murmurs. The reporters were already texting under the tables. Ellie handed the mic back to the tech. She turned without another word and walked off the stage, down the center aisle. Not a soul moved to stop her. The whispers followed her like a crown. The woman scorned, the woman forgotten, the woman they never saw coming. Outside, the air was cold and sharp, just like it had been that night in the garden. Ellie pulled her coat tighter, stepped into the waiting car. "Where to?" the driver asked. Ellie smiled faintly. "Not yet, just drive," because there were still pieces left on the board, and Ellie intended to knock every single one off. Charles Prescott had always believed in two things: appearances and control. If a man looked like he had power, he had power. If he controlled the narrative, he owned the truth. And for 4 decades, Charles had been the architect of his own legend, founder of Prescott Global Holdings, keynote speaker at summits, a fixture on philanthropic boards. A man with charm, polish, and just enough ruthlessness to make the world bend to his will. But legends, like glass, shatter when struck just right. Ellie had struck him dead center. It began the morning after the gala. The Wall Street Journal ran the headline in red: "Prescott Global Under Investigation Following Gala Hack and Anonymous Document Leak." Within hours, his private line lit up with panicked calls. The board demanded answers. Investors threatened to pull out. And worst of all, his assistant, a loyal woman named Carrie who had managed his life for 20 years, simply walked out. No goodbye. Just a sticky note on his desk. "I always suspected. I just didn't want to know." Charles barely had time to read it before 2 IRS agents arrived at the office. Auditors. With a warrant. They went through everything: laptops, offshore activity, corporate write-offs. He tried to protest, but they waved him off with cool efficiency. "This is standard, Mr. Prescott. When someone anonymously provides over 700 pages of detailed financial irregularities, we investigate." Anonymous. But Charles knew. He saw Ellie's fingerprints in every line. Every detail he had once deemed too complex for her to understand had been used against him. He went home early that day, though home now meant a luxury penthouse he and Diane had purchased after throwing Ellie out of the estate. A space filled with chrome and glass and emptiness. Diane was there, pacing. She didn't ask about the audit. She didn't need to. She had her own disaster to manage. "She released that photo," Diane said, voice trembling. "The one of me and..." She couldn't even say Tommy's name. Couldn't even look at Charles. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Charles snapped. "Why did you keep it?" Diane turned on him, eyes wild. "Why did you keep it? You found it! You put it in the safe!" "I didn't know what to believe," he hissed. "I thought maybe it was just manipulation, a sick joke. I wanted proof." "She was your son's best friend," Diane said, softer now, eyes narrowing. "Don't pretend you didn't have your own reasons to stay quiet. You were just afraid of the truth." Charles flinched. Because she was right. He had been afraid. Not of Diane. Not even of what might have happened with Tommy. But of the chaos it would bring. The scandal. The judgment. He had spent 40 years building an empire on polished lies, and now they were collapsing in real time. The next day, the subpoenas came. So did the first lawsuit, filed by a former partner alleging securities fraud. Ellie's file dump had included emails from 10 years ago. Backroom deals, inflated valuations, whispers about laundering money through shell companies Charles thought no one could trace. But Ellie had traced everything, in silence, in shadows. She had known for years. And now, she was dragging it all into the light. The media swarmed. Paparazzi camped outside the building. News vans lined the street. Former allies cut ties one by one. Even his own daughter, Caroline, his precious Ivy League-schooled investment banker, sent a single message via encrypted text. "I've spoken to my lawyer. Please don't contact me or the kids until further notice." Charles sat in the penthouse that night alone, the city stretching out beneath him like a kingdom he could no longer command. The whiskey didn't taste like it used to. Nothing did. He turned on the TV. The news anchor was mid-report. Unconfirmed reports suggest whistleblower documents were prepared over the course of 15 years by Eleanor Prescott, the former wife of Charles Prescott, and now dubbed the invisible architect behind his unraveling. He turned it off. But the silence was worse. The truth was no longer something he could hide behind charity galas and Rolexes. It had shape now. Teeth. It had Ellie's name on it. And for the first time in his life, Charles Prescott understood what it felt like to be powerless. He wasn't in control anymore. She was. And she wasn't finished. The headlines burned across every screen. Prescott empire crumbles in wake of wife's exposé. The woman behind the ruin, Eleanor Prescott's decade of secrets. From housewife to hurricane, where is Ellie now? But the truth was, no one knew. Because by the time the last subpoena hit Charles's desk, by the time Diane's private messages to Tommy's attorney leaked to the press, and by the time the final offshore account was emptied, Eleanor Prescott was already gone. She had left behind no press statement, no tearful interviews, no victory dance. Just silence. And silence was Ellie's masterpiece. A week before the gala, she'd packed only what she needed. A passport, a flash drive, a weathered notebook of passwords, and a ring box containing her grandmother's emerald. Everything else she left behind. Clothes, mementos, even her wedding ring, which she had placed delicately on Charles's side of their former bed with a handwritten note. "Here's the only thing you never managed to steal, my freedom." Her departure was orchestrated like a symphony. The offshore accounts, 9 in total, had been quietly closed. The money had been converted to cryptocurrency and gold bullion. The deed to a villa on a remote island, acquired under a shell company she formed in 2011, had already been transferred to a new alias. Ellie Prescott ceased to exist. In her place, a new woman was born. The air was warm and salty where she now lived. The waves spoke in a language she had waited 40 years to hear. She sat on the terrace of a stone house carved into the cliffs, barefoot and serene, the sea stretching out before her like an open road. Her hair was no longer styled, no longer colored into submission. It curled freely in the breeze, silver streaks catching the sun. She looked nothing like the woman who once stood behind Charles at board dinners, quietly smiling while he told stories that erased her. Here, people called her Isadora, and that was enough. One afternoon, a postcard arrived at the Langston Hotel. No return address. Just a photograph of a rocky coastline and a caption in handwriting that Charles would have recognized instantly. "I thought you'd like the view. You always said you wanted to retire by the sea. I got there first. E." He read it twice, hands trembling. Then he tore it in half. But not before Diane saw it. Not before the fury in her face betrayed the truth she'd never been able to voice aloud. They hadn't won. They had been played. She hadn't just been betrayed by a wife. She'd been outwitted by a woman she thought was weak. Charles collapsed into the chair, numb. There was nothing left now. No business, no reputation, no Caroline, no Tommy, no fortress of lies. And Ellie? She'd vanished with dignity. Vanished with every piece of leverage she needed to make sure they could never follow. Back on the island, Ellie walked the narrow path to the harbor each morning, carrying a basket for fruit and fresh bread. The locals didn't ask questions. They just nodded politely, respectful of her privacy. She paid in cash, kept to herself, and smiled without offering too much of her past. Because the past didn't matter here. What mattered was the present, the weightlessness of it. No lies, no manipulation, no looking over her shoulder. For the first time since her 20s, Ellie laughed freely. She had lost everything the world once told her mattered: status, marriage, social circles. And in its place, she had found the one thing she never expected: herself. She spent her evenings writing, journaling by candlelight, sometimes drafting letters she never intended to send. Letters to Tommy. To Caroline. Even to Diane. Not out of forgiveness, but release, letting go of old weights, and then she'd burn them, one by one, over the terrace fire pit, watching the smoke rise like exorcisms. One night, a young American traveler asked her name. She smiled and simply said, "Izzy." He nodded, unfazed. "Nice to meet you." She watched him walk away, then looked out over the dark sea. A part of her wondered if Charles still believed he was in control, even as the walls closed in. A part of her wondered if Diane still checked the mail in fear. And a small, wicked part of her hoped they did. But most of her had moved on. Ellie Prescott had spent 40 years being the woman everyone expected. Now, Eleanor, Isadora, was whoever she wanted to be. Free, untraceable, reborn. And as the waves whispered against the rocks, one truth settled in her bones like a vow. She hadn't just survived betrayal, she had outlived it.